If you're like me, old photographs fascinate you. A photograph captures any moment, pure or evil. It is a record, a memory. Sometimes it is all that remains. Over the past few months, I have found myself transfixed, pulled into the past of my home, Portsmouth, New Hampshire. One photograph, tattered and stained, unremarkable, captured my attention while exploring the archives. An unidentified woman stands by the street, several buildings visible around her. What chilled me was the thought that, although all in this photo have passed, the place remains the same. The buildings are still there, only now we stand in her place. The most prominent building in the photograph is the National Block, built by Frank Jones in 1878, located on Congress Street. Looking down Congress Street, the natural assumption is that much has changed in the past 100 years, and while this is true, things have changed more often for the better here than for the worse. It's always surprised me that the street is actually more dense than it was 100 years ago. Along it lie mixed-use blocks not only from before the 1930s, but from almost every decade following. The National Block is now flanked by mid-rise blocks from the 2010s and the 1920s through 30s. And look at this crazy 1970s block from just down the street. So, how has the city of Portsmouth, New Hampshire managed to buck the trend of hollow downtowns and widened roads? The story is complicated with many missteps and chance happenings, and a whole lot of grit, all culminating in the city that we see today. That's why I decided to make this video, to show a rare positive example of how a city can save itself from complete destruction and learn to adapt itself for a better future. Local architectural historian Richard Candy sums it up best. Portsmouth is going to change. The secret is trying to figure out how to have the best possible outcome instead of the worst. This is the story of the city preserved through poverty, partially destroyed and now rebuilt brick by brick. Before jumping in, a little background is necessary. Portsmouth has a long and storied past, being settled in 1623. Although I'd love to tell you everything, I will focus on the parts that are important in understanding how the city retained a majority of its downtown. Founded on the Piscataqua River, the city's primary industry would become shipbuilding, being home to the oldest naval shipyard in America, founded in 1801. Because of the cyclical nature of military shipbuilding and just shipbuilding in general, the town often fell on hard times between major building periods at the military yard, and the economy would suffer greatly. The civilian shipyards were often the only thing preventing a total economic collapse of the city. The first major downfall of Portsmouth was during the War of 1812, when the city's merchant economy largely collapsed, despite a boom in military ship construction. And although Portsmouth would go on to build some of the first nuclear submarines, the base and therefore the city fell on hard times again in the years following World War II. By the Second World War, the majority of civilian shipbuilding had long since disappeared, leaving little to fall back on. All of these boom and bust cycles had led to the construction of architecturally stunning buildings, which often fell into states of disrepair. Falling on hard times after World War II meant a few things for Portsmouth. Although the city had ample land, there was little reason or wealth to sustain the building of major suburban tracts. Young people would also often leave to find success elsewhere. The tradition of Return of the Sons in the 1850s and 1870s testified to the scale of the export. Despite this having been a trend for over a century, it did accelerate as things got worse. This decline was one of the major reasons why the old and dilapidated mixed-use blocks were not entirely destroyed, because there was a lack of funding or economic need to replace them with anything else. But that said, this state of decline could only last for so long. Soon would come those who looked on these decrepit old buildings and sought only to destroy them. When city leaders and planners in the 1950s through 70s across America set out to demolish large swaths of the places that they served, they did so with the belief that it was these neighborhoods, these few bad blocks, which were holding the entire city back. In their minds, the best possible outcome would be to tear them down. Cities around the US received federal funds to renew themselves through the flattening of blighted neighborhoods and thereby the removal of anybody deemed undesirable. Their land was often redeveloped into low-density strip malls and highways, but not everywhere did that story play out the same, and sometimes when those neighborhoods were destroyed, the soil stripped, nothing would replace them. That is, until more recently. In Portsmouth, this would be the case. To better frame urban renewal in the city, it is important to understand its layout. Although having a small population of only around 20,000 people today, Portsmouth is comprised of several distinct neighborhoods. The West End, once home to Frank Jones Brewery, the largest in the world during its day, and currently lower density yet historical homes. Downtown and Market Square, the beating heart of Portsmouth and one of my favorite places in the entire world. Pottle Dock, now Strawberry Bank and Prescott Park, the original settlement location and at one point the red light district. The South End, a dense residential neighborhood largely constructed by Central European and Jewish immigrants. And finally, the North End. The North End was a residential neighborhood, like the South End, located just north of the downtown, around the Boston and Maine rail yard. As mentioned, one of the city's greatest exports was its population, and so by the 1890s, Italian immigrant families had replaced a majority of the original residents. The neighborhood had become poor, as many younger generations moved away, and those who stayed did not always have the money to maintain their homes. Despite receiving significant backlash, almost the entire neighborhood would be flattened by the 1970s. But this is where the story shifts. Despite part of the North End eventually being home to the Parade Mall, most of the land would remain undeveloped. After only 40 years, the Parade Mall would close. The city was left with a choice: let the mall be redeveloped into something else car-centric, or to move in a new direction. Following the beginning of urban renewal in the North End, several local banks located on State Street began their own form of private urban renewal. Their 1965 plan to transform the downtown would have involved almost the complete destruction of the mixed-use buildings along State Street and leading into Market Square. The banks actually began demolition of mixed-use and historic structures in order to create drive-thrus and parking lots for their clients. In a direct response to this wanton destruction, several residents got together to create a downtown historic district. It was a fight, but the historic district was finally created in the 1970s. Residents had thought to rehabilitate not only the city's economy, but also its beauty and walkability. It was clear that efforts still needed to be taken in reshaping the downtown, just not in the way that the banks wanted. In the late 1970s, city planner Bob Thorson set about revitalizing Market Square. What had once been the city's main market had become a disorganized intersection for 5 different streets. To achieve success, Thorson had to fight significant opposition from the local business community. Many business owners saw the 1965 plan to add parking as just what was needed to convince would-be bypassers to stay and shop. What that plan overlooked was what made Market Square special in the first place. The project to renovate the square added large bump outs and shrunk the number of lanes. The smaller streets were also made less important for cars, thanks to the efforts of Bob Thorson and many others in the community. Market Square and downtown are now not only places where people need to come, they are places where people want to spend their time. Market Square stood and stands in stark contrast to what became of the North End. It was quickly apparent that the aforementioned mall was not generating the expected draw to the site. The mall also only took up a small portion of the cleared land. Several ideas had been proposed to replace the North End. Among them were a fish factory and an extension of the road salt port. Knowing what this would mean for the downtown, then city manager Cal Kenny and others fought bad proposals until a hotel was finally built 30 years after the demolition. A few years after the hotel would come the most important development on this site. More on that in a moment, but first a quick reminder to please like, subscribe, and comment if you want to see more content like this. I would also like to thank the Portsmouth Athenaeum for free use of their images. I wouldn't have been able to make this video without their help, so please check out their website and also feel free to donate. Now back to the reconstruction of the North End. The Parade Mall itself was, in 2016, replaced with Portwalk Place. Portwalk Place is a collection of mixed-use towers, and itself really feels like an extension of the city, while giving the illusion of being several smaller buildings. Although it can never replace what was lost, the restaurants and shops revitalized the dead mall and parking lots. The rebuilding of the city has not been limited to the North End either. What did not happen in the city was the preservation of structures which would have prevented redensification. One of the best examples is 18 Congress Street. At this location were once 2 houses and a movie theater from the 1920s. One of the houses was lost in the fire, but the other 2 buildings were saved. In many cities, these 2 remaining structures would have been preserved at any cost. Instead, they were replaced with a 4- and 5-story structure, which is home to 1 floor of commercial, 1 floor of office, and the remainder of residential, while also matching the character of the buildings around it. Looking at the city today, a few things stand out. The modern city is surprisingly walkable by American and even European standards. In part, this is due to the city's compact nature and mixed-use character, with most of the buildings having storefronts that feel open and inviting. In a way, they are an extension of the street. Portsmouth adapts, grows, and has the missing middle buildings that most towns are missing. Several factories also line the Piscataqua River in neighboring Newington, making everything from undersea cables to fish sticks, all served by local rail freight. This is where the city is successful. Portsmouth is not perfect, however. We haven't done enough to improve affordability, bikeability, and transit. The modern city is almost unaffordable for the people who work there to live there. Although a new micro apartment project without parking has just received support, it is too little, too late. Something has to give, or else we risk becoming for tourists only. In addition to the affordability problem, I would focus on increasing safety for average people who use bikes as transportation. The West End, for example, is a current hotspot for development. Despite this, most people who live there are just a little too far to walk comfortably to downtown, and many end up driving despite not wanting to. This issue could be solved not with bike lanes, but with separated cycle tracks like these here. Finally, I would reintroduce passenger rail to the city. If walking is for everyone and biking is for locals, passenger rail could be a solution for the waves of tourists that flood the city every summer. Looking to the future, what has always surprised me about Portsmouth is that despite being steadfast in preservation of the past, the city's not afraid to try new things. A new market hall and pedestrian street are opening within the year. The old YMCA building was painstakingly redeveloped into a modern jazz and blues club, and new mixed-use buildings will soon replace parking lots near the railroad tracks, erasing the final vestiges of urban renewal's scars. Cities cannot stay frozen in time. While a photograph captures a snapshot, a moment in time, cities do not have the luxury of standing still. While the power of a photograph is to remind us of what was, the power of a place, a city, stems from its ability to change and adapt to a changing world. Within a fixed moment exist the inspirations that move us to action. The destruction of the North End, captured in celluloid, spurred preservation of the remaining city and rebuilding of what was lost. My viewing of a place I knew so well, so long before I'd come to know it, sparked the inspiration for this video. But when a city changes and shows its residents what is possible if only we learn to adapt, they also learn to care about the place where they live. We cannot possibly predict what the future will hold, but maybe we're not meant to. Like preserving a moment in a photograph, perhaps we're meant to shape the future as we think it should be.